and I'm gonna be high.
Hey, you've tuned into T.C. McCarthy, the most exciting science fiction author on video. This episode is going to be a special Thanksgiving episode where we take a look in the past of U.S. spaceflight and one of the more well-known accidents, the Shuttle Challenger disaster. So those of you who are watching who are old enough probably remember the details, but those of you who are young don't. And basically what happened was that anytime you climb into a spacecraft, that is a ship that has been built by the lowest bidder, and so you're getting basically the best ship that, well, money can buy, in the sense that the one that costs the least. Now, how does this relate to my upcoming book, Tyger Burning? Well, its main character, Maung, is terrified of space travel, and he would be even more terrified if he actually knew anything about it at all, and because of his circumstances, he's never been into space, never been on board a spaceship, but if he knew the details of how these things are built and the kinds of things that could go wrong, well, it would really make him about 1,000 times more scared than he already is. So let's go ahead and get started and do an overview of what happened with the Space Shuttle Challenger. And as you watch this, let's keep in mind that 7 astronauts lost their lives in this disaster, so I'm going to try and treat this with the utmost of respect. The Orings Failed. What do I mean by that? Well, in the morning of January, it was in January 1986 when the shuttle actually finally took off. On the morning of the launch, it had just experienced a cold front that brought temperatures down 20 degrees colder than any previous shuttle mission had experienced. Now, one engineer from the company responsible for constructing the 2 solid fuel boosters, those thin, narrow rockets on either side of the main liquid oxygen hydrogen storage tank, the kind of reddish rust-colored major tank is liquid oxygen and hydrogen. The company responsible for constructing those 2 booster rockets on either side did so by constructing it in segments. They would do it vertically, so they would build one small segment, fill it with aluminum and ammonium perchlorate. Those are the fuel and oxidizer mixtures that basically form a solid rocket fuel. So they would build one segment. On the top was a series of O-rings that then the next segment would come on and snap into, kind of, to form a good seal, and then the 2 sections would be bolted together. Now, the way that these solid rocket boosters operate is that once you touch them off, you cannot turn them off at all. They go until they're empty. And so one engineer from the company, I think it was Morton Thiokol, I'll have to look that up, but I think one engineer from the company started giving warnings. He knew that at those temperatures, the O-rings could fail. And it was so cold that morning that literally ice was covering almost every surface on the launch pad itself. To make things worse, over the night, the shuttle had been swaying back and forth in a fairly strong wind that had been blowing, and that too put additional stresses on the O-rings and the joints that made this particular engineer very nervous. Now, the problem was that the previous shuttle launch had been delayed by so many cautions that in retrospect, people speculated that maybe NASA was getting a little bit too worried about what people would think about them and not worried enough about safety of their astronauts. And so that engineer had reason to be worried. I think I was 16 at the time. I was at boarding school, and I remember very vividly when somebody grabbed me and pulled me down to the mailroom of my school and pulled me to the TV and said, "Look what happened." And I recall going, what's the big deal? And they said, "Well, the Challenger has exploded." I thought they were kidding. I never ever in my wildest dreams thought that something like this would happen in my lifetime, but as I sat there watching the television, it happened. It's one of those moments where you'll never forget where you were at the time that it happened. Now, what apparently happened is that, in fact, one of the O-ring joints did, in fact, fail. The shuttle took off, and as they did the investigation after the disaster and looked back at some of the footage, you can actually see the moment of failure where a puff of black smoke comes from one of the O-ring joints in the solid rocket booster that initially failed. And what that is basically the rubber of the O-ring getting consumed as the rocket fuel is burning through on the solid rocket booster. What happened next was horrific. Basically, the solid rocket fuel around or near that joint started to burn and then came out through the joint itself where it was never intended to come out and shot like a blowtorch directly into the side of the main liquid hydrogen fuel tank. Now, that fuel tank sustained it for a little while, but I think after about 70-something seconds, that tank ruptured, and what people call an explosion was actually not an explosion. You got release of mists of fuel and oxidizer that in turn ignited, and slowly, and when I say slowly, I mean relatively slowly, it was not an instantaneous explosion. Slowly, you got a conflagration that basically caused bits and pieces of the shuttle to break up in increments. So at one point you see the solid rocket boosters fly off in either direction, and then you see bits and fragments of pieces of the shuttle kind of trailing contrails of smoke fly through the atmosphere, continue to ascend until gravity takes over and everything plummets to the ground. Now, the surviving rocket boosters, NASA controllers eventually remotely detonated those so they wouldn't keep going and land in a populated area. Now, at this time, the crew ascended to an altitude of about 12 miles, 13 miles, somewhere around there, and then plummeted back to Earth. One of the big questions that's been hotly debated but is slowly pinning over toward one side of the debate was, did the crew survive the initial kind of detonations, or did the crew die as soon as things started to go wrong and their shuttle broke apart? NASA itself in its report said that they couldn't really tell for sure if everyone went unconscious immediately or if they survived the initial blast. But when dive crews in March of 1986 went to the ocean floor to look for pieces, they found the crew compartment largely intact, and they started to see several bits of evidence that pointed to at least some of the crew survived that initial detonation and then probably died upon impact on the water. Now, when you fall from those heights in the crew compartment, they probably hit at about 200 miles an hour, and hitting water at that speed, as one NASA engineer put it, is like slamming into concrete. The first thing that divers noticed was that all the seat belts were in place, all the chairs were in place, they had not been dislodged, and that the straps themselves had held, but they definitely showed signs of strain. So, we know from that one thing, as soon as the crew compartment hit the water, everybody was still in their seats. The other thing they started to notice was that these astronauts had emergency oxygen packs, I think some of them at least were attached to the backs of their chairs, and somebody had leaned forward and switched on the pilot's emergency oxygen pack, and I think at least 2 others had been switched on. So they knew at the initial detonation time, they knew that something had gone wrong. Probably there was some depressurization, and several of them reacted. Now, several news stations at the time consulted with an astronaut, Story Musgrave, and his opinion, and I believe his opinion since he has experience both as an astronaut and a surgeon, is that they likely survived the initial explosion of the fuel tanks. Not enough energy was released to really damage the crew compartment or its occupants. He believed they survived that and then plummeted for almost 2 minutes to their death when they hit the water. And to quote Story Musgrave, they died when they hit the water. We know that. There's nothing controversial about it. There is hard evidence. So now, as of 2018, Thanksgiving, it looks like what happened was that when the shuttle began to break up, at least some of the astronauts survived or remained conscious, and were fully aware as they went down for 2 minutes before hitting the water that a catastrophe had happened and that they were most likely riding the remains of the shuttle to their death. I can't imagine the kind of terror and fear that they must have felt at that point. Another astronaut, Overmyer, basically commented that in his opinion, Sobey, I think he was the pilot, one of the crew of the Challenger, Sobey rode that plane all the way down and tried to do anything he could to fight for their lives. That's why these people are heroes. Well, no U.S. government story would be complete without a cover-up, and in some people's opinion, there was a cover-up. In my opinion, this is basically the banality of a bureaucracy. I'm not sure that there was an intentional cover-up as much as there was an effort to basically keep facts from getting out before they had a chance to be fully digested and analyzed, but certainly I can see from some people's perspective it looked and smelled like a cover-up. Alright, so what am I talking about? Well, one of the main things that came out of the research that was done after the Challenger disaster was that there was no safety mechanism in place for the shuttle astronauts to survive something like this. Here we are in a situation where the crew compartment survived, and in that situation there was no parachutes, there was no engineered solution to what happens if the crew compartment, which is reinforced, separates from the main shuttle and plummets to Earth. One would think maybe you could put something in there or engineer something safety-wise to save the astronauts in that condition, because as one person put it, if those astronauts had fallen to the ground slowly, they could have swam back to shore. So investigators, as they pieced together the wreckage, concluded that the shuttle crew compartment, once it broke apart and started spinning, eventually normalized itself and went straight nose first, straight down toward the water. So the people conscious and alive still at that point were watching through the windscreen as the ocean approached them. And the Coast Guard, as they went through their debris recovery efforts, eventually found a piece of wreckage that included notebooks and scraps of personal effects, and also a part of a helmet that had ears and scalp still attached inside. But when NASA found out about that, they immediately tried to keep the Coast Guard personnel silent. Now, some journalists have interpreted that as attempts at a cover-up. I look at that and think, of course they did. You have family members who are grieving at this point, and would you really want to know those details? Granted, we have to know those details to make sure it never happens again, but at that point, I think NASA was basically struggling to figure out what to do with all this horrific information. So after some distance and time has passed, I think that the people who kind of look at this as a conspiracy versus the people who maybe have a more clinical view, or NASA engineers themselves, I hope that they've come to this point, but I see this as not a cover-up necessarily, but just an effort to get things right, and quite frankly, an effort to deal with human emotion on a scale that probably we hadn't seen in the US for a very long time. So as I complete this, I'm going to put an image up here of the Challenger crew itself. I hope that you all can say a quick prayer for them and keep them in your thoughts. They are American heroes. And as I post this picture, I'm going to go ahead and read aloud the last transmissions that were taped by the Challenger crew as all of this unfolded up to the moment when the first kind of detonation of the main fuel tank happened. T-0. Resnick says, all right. T+01. Smith says, here we go. T+07. Scobie. Houston, we have a roll program. T+11. Smith, go you mother. T+14. Resnick. LVLH. He's reminding the flight crew about switch from a ground base to a vehicle-based frame of reference. Local, vertical, local, horizontal. She's hot. It's actually not she's. It's an expletive that starts with SH, so you can do the math. T+16. Scobie. Okay. T+19. Smith. Looks like we've got a lot of wind up here today. T+20. Scobie. Yeah, it's a little hard to see out my window here. T+28. Smith. There's 10,000 feet and Mach 0.5. Scobie. 0.9. T+40. Smith. There's Mach 1. T+41. Scobie. Going through 19,000 feet. Okay, we're throttling down. T+57. Scobie. Throttling up. T+58. Smith. Throttle up. T+59. Scobie. Roger. T+1 minute, 2 seconds. Smith. 35,000 going through 1.5. T+1 minute, 5 seconds. Scobie. Reading 486 on mine. That was an airspeed indicator check. T+1 minute, 7 seconds. Smith. Yep, that's what I've got too. T+1 minute, 10 seconds. Scobie. Roger. Go at throttle up. T+1 minute, 13 seconds. Smith. Uh-oh. Those are the last words recorded by astronauts on the Shuttle Challenger. Now, I know this has been a somber episode, more somber than ones I've done in the past, but spaceflight has its dangers. They're very real. Mankind made a decision long ago that those dangers are worth facing, and I totally agree. The Shuttle Challenger disaster set back the US space program by quite a bit. I remember when I was a teenager, everything being put on hold for years, literally years, until the next shuttle mission launched. And that wasn't the end of accidents for NASA with respect to the shuttle. In a future version, I'll go over the Shuttle Columbia disaster, which happened when I was a young man with my first child. But for now, I'm going to wrap this one up and tell you again thanks for watching, and definitely please consider buying my books. And again, stay tuned for my next book coming out in July 2019, Tyger Burning. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone, end transmission. Hey, T.C. McCarthy here, the most eclectic and entertaining science fiction author on YouTube, maybe even the internet. Thanks for watching this video. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. As usual, buy my books. I've got a new one coming out in July, and I'll have a giveaway coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. Appreciate you subscribing to my channel, and please, 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 please don't forget to click that little bell icon so that whenever I upload new content, you get notified. Thanks again. See you soon.
I miss the earth so much. I miss my wife.